Welcome to the 10-Minute Treasurer. My name is Jeff Pospisil, and I'm an accountant, and I'm comparing the United Methodist denomination to the Global Methodist denomination as an accountant. So I'm not focusing on theological issues or anything like that, but I'm thinking of things that an accountant would be worried about, and probably the average layperson would be worried about. And so this video, I'm going to cover the trust clause, which happens to deal with the ownership of property. And so that's what we're going to learn about. What's the difference between the two denominations when it comes to the trust clause? Where did the trust clause come from? And are there pros and cons to a trust clause? So when we compare the two denominations, the United Methodists do have a trust clause. And what does that mean practically? That means that if a church wants to buy or sell or mortgage a property, they would need the approval of the conference in order to do that. So the district superintendent or a district committee would have to sign off on it before they could go forward. For the Global Methodists, they do not. This is a church decision. There is a process for how a Global Methodist Church is to do those property transactions, and I believe the leadership team, whatever that is, the board of directors or whatever you want to call it, they need to approve it, and then a charge conference needs to happen. So it'll still have to go up for vote within the church, but you don't need that outside approval. I want to give you just a quick history on the trust clause, because the trust clause in the Methodist movement goes back to almost the very beginning. So we trace it back to John Wesley, who was one of the founders of the Methodist movement, and he was a clergy in the Church of England. But the Methodist movement, it was frowned upon, and eventually John Wesley was no longer welcome in these Church of England buildings. And so he had to take to open air preaching, and there was a lot of benefits to that, moving out to the public and being able to reach a lot more people, but also it can suck some days to not have a place to gather, especially in rainy country like England. So John Wesley, out of his own pocket, started buying properties to be used as Methodist gathering spots. And the debt ended up becoming a little bit big, and they eventually organized these class meetings so they could take an offering to help John Wesley pay down the debt on these properties. So this provided a gathering spot for Methodists. So that was the first thing that the trust clause accomplished. Also kind of interesting is that it was the denomination basically buying these. So it was the class meetings, and John Wesley was paying for these different meeting spots. It wasn't just the people that were using those meeting spots. And then the other thing, though, that came about was, and I don't know if John Wesley had planned this from the beginning or not, but because John Wesley owned the pew, he could determine who preached behind the pew. So that was his version of quality control. So he really had a high degree of accountability for his Methodist preachers. If you read through some of his letters, I mean, he had very high standards for his preachers. And so that was the other one, is you own the pulpit, you get to determine who stands behind the pulpit. So a church couldn't go rogue, or a congregation couldn't go rogue just because maybe somebody preached a more popular message at the time. So hopefully I've made a good case for why the trust clause was valid and important in the past. Now I'm going to try to make a case for why the trust clause is important today for the local church, not just the denomination. So first of all, it helps ensure pastor supply. And you might say, well, how? Well, I'm going to tell you, as somebody that was in the leadership of a denomination, that it does remind you of that historical commitment. That just the same way John Wesley felt the pressure to provide timely, quality pastors for his preaching spots, we still feel that. We feel that that's the trade-off, that because of the trust clause, you deserve a timely, quality pastor. And I remember even Bishop O kind of lamenting at when we failed at this. And and partially it goes back to that trust clause, is that constant reminder of our commitment to the local church. It provides stability for churches. If you've ever went from one church to another church, you know how disorienting that could be. Well, the trust clause prevents the whole congregation from going through that. Because a lot of times the reason why you normally might leave a church is there was some incident and it gets blown out of proportion and you leave, and then anyway, it causes an unnecessary disruption when you look in the rearview mirror. So you would prevent that for a local church, seeing something that maybe it's popped up in the news, or maybe there was an incident with a district superintendent or something like that. Well, chances are 5 years from now it'll seem like nothing, and you would have gone through all that work of changing for no good reason. You gain an outside perspective in property decisions. Because the denomination is required to sign off on it, you get the district superintendent and others that have experiences of their own being able to chime in and give you some advice when you're working through property transactions. Because most of us in our own local church, we might go through one or two major additions or building projects in our lifetime, but now you are bringing in people that have a lot of other experiences too. So that's important too. And sometimes they even have more of that strategic view. I remember we had one church that for a season they were down in membership and unable to afford a full-time pastor, and so they had an empty parsonage at the time, and they wanted to sell it in order to help make ends meet. Anyway, the district superintendent didn't allow it because he saw the potential in this community and in this church, and that one day they would need a residential pastor or a pastor in that parsonage. So anyway, that's some of the benefit of having somebody from the outside. And then also, I like this one myself. If a church closes, the state will go to continuing the church's work. So what this means is when a church closes currently, the net assets usually go to something United Methodist related. Sometimes it's to launching a new church, sometimes it's to a camp, whatever the church is passionate about. So the trust clause helps us remember that, and it benefits the church's work and not just the community or some other pet projects that maybe some people in leadership at the time want. It's the whole church's work. I just made the case for the trust clause, and now I want to try to make the case against the trust clause, and just leave it up to you for you to decide which one's more compelling. So first of all, people who paid for the property should control the property. It might have made sense when the denomination had a lot of skin in the game for them to have a lot of control. So when John Wesley and the class meetings were providing the bulk of the resources to buy the property, yeah, they should have a big say in how that property is used. But think of your church today. How much did the denomination contribute to your current property? I would guess that 95 to 100% of what was used to pay for your current property was donated by the people in the pew. So if you don't have a lot of skin in the game, why should you have control? The next one is it allows churches to be more nimble and more creative. Part of the reason why I think this is the case is because sometimes when you have somebody that comes in and they've seen how church property is normally used and how transactions normally happen, you tend to start thinking in the box. I know that's my habit, is I start saying, well, this is the way things should happen. But if you have people that don't know, you're going to have some bad ideas, but you might have some really good creative ideas too. And you could also act a little bit quicker if you're not waiting for a district superintendent or a district committee to meet and make some decisions. So you can be a little bit quicker, a little bit more creative. Greater freedom to leave the denomination if need be. So if let's just say there is something very big and very serious that's coming up and there doesn't seem to be any resolution, and you've tried, you can leave the denomination and you don't have to worry about property issues. You just have to change the names on your deeds and change the name of your church. And that's, so I mean, it's not exactly free, but there is a lot more freedom. And the last one is there's greater accountability for the denomination. I think one of the things I always tried, at least in the Dakotas UMC, is make it so that people wanted to be United Methodist, that they would see it as a good thing, that their apportionments were being used in a way that benefited them as well as everything else. So they wanted to give apportionments. This is what I was hoping for anyway. Now, without a trust clause, everybody has to be worried about that, because in the denominational leadership, you have to provide such good service that the church sees a benefit, that they will be loyal because they have to, not because they want to keep their property. So anyway, it does provide a little bit greater accountability for that denomination that they should feel. Hopefully this has helped provide you some insights into the trust clause, the case for and against, the history of it. Is it valid today? I do like the connection that it forces, but is it beneficial, I guess, for the work of the Methodist movement and the work of the Lord through the Methodist movement today? That's a good question. All right, till next time, God bless.